Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first of the Riskfactor Masterclasses. Thank you for joining us today. We appreciate how busy everybody is, so these sessions are designed to be short and focus on specific risk factor topics, the first one today being the risk score. Just before we move into the session, just a little bit of housekeeping, just to let you know that everybody will be on mute during the session today, and we won't be able to take any live questions, but we did ask for questions ahead of the session, and we'll be covering those towards the end. I'm sure we've spoken to many of you on the call before, but by way of introduction, we're the account management team here at Equinity Risk Factor. I'm Andrea Tanner, Head of Customer Success, and I lead the account team and look after a number of our key customers. I've been with Risk Factor for nearly 4 years, and prior to that worked in the receivables finance industry. I was a client manager at Yorkshire Bank and also headed up the client management team there. I'm joined today by two of our account directors, Richard Pride and Dan Smith, and I'll just hand over to Richard for him to introduce himself.
Cool, thanks Andrea. Hi everyone, my name is Richard Pride. I've got about 7 years working in industry prior to working here over at Risk Factor. I've been here for about 2 years. Prior to that I was working at a high street bank and also as an independent, working in a variety of roles from assistant relationship manager to auditor to relationship manager, so I have quite a widespread knowledge of how the system works. I'll just pass over to Dan.
Brilliant, thanks Richard. Hi, I'm Dan. I've got around 16 years experience in banking and invoice finance, having worked in the commercial finance space for the majority of my career. Worked at both RBS Invoice Finance and Ultimate Finance in various sort of client management roles, and joined Risk Factor around 18 months ago, initially working on a number of consultancy projects, assisting our clients in making the most of the Risk Factor system, and then into the account management team. As a result of COVID, we've seen training move from in-person to virtual. These sessions have proven very popular over the last 2 years, and to extend this to the wider Risk Factor community, we're providing several sessions focusing on specific topics during 2022, which are free of charge. For some of you more experienced Risk Factor users, hopefully this session will be a good refresher, or if you're relatively new to Risk Factor, the aim of this session is to help improve your understanding. After today, if anyone's got any suggestions for any other topics you'd like to see covered as part of these sessions, please do let us know. And of course, please let anyone else know about the sessions that you may think would benefit from them as well. And as Andrea mentioned, obviously, as part of the registration process, we've asked for questions ahead of the session, and we will cover these at the end.
Great, cool. All right, so first of all, just to look at why we're covering the risk score. So we all know that Risk Factor in itself is a risk analytics tool. It looks at trends and changes. However, it isn't as much as providing these scores and this raw data. There's also a human element that's very important for the software and for understanding how it works. So the risk score in particular, it's a measure that we get lots of questions about from lots of our users, and I'll be put my hands up and be honest, when I was working in the industry, I didn't perfectly know how the score worked. And that's the reason why we've started with this particular measure, because it is fundamentally a part of Risk Factor, and it is a very key measure that you'll be using hopefully on a day-to-day basis. And after this session, hopefully you'll be using it a lot more and using it correctly.
Thanks, Richard. So as we can see here on the screen, we've got all of the different measures that make up the risk score. So for a bulk ID client, the risk score is made of 7 components. Or for a factoring client or clients where we receive extracted data and we have the top debtor information, it's made up of 8 components. Each of the components is given a maximum score out of 10 or 20, and then these are combined to give the overall risk score. So for a bulk ID client, you will have a maximum score of 120, but for a factoring client or the clients where we have the extracted data, that will be a maximum score of 140. So that you can compare the clients against each other, we normalise the risk score to give it a maximum score out of 100, and it's always the normalised score that you should use. So to understand the risk score in more detail, we recommend you using the risk score analysis grid, and this should already be in your system and deployed as standard. If you check and you haven't got that there, let us know and we can send you a screenshot to show you how this grid should be configured. So this is always our go-to place. So if you have a risk score that's increasing or changing and you're not sure why, this is the place that we will recommend that you would go to. So what we're going to do now is just move into our demo system and just walk through the different components of the risk score.
Like that, just take myself off mute. Cool. So as you can see here, I'm now showing a copy of our demo system, and ultimately if you were to go to the grids at the top, you can see here you've got the risk score grid there at the bottom. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off towards the right of the grid, and the reason for this is because it will show all the individual measures. At the very left of the grid, when we come to the end, it will actually show the total, so how the risk score is actually added up and then normalized. So we're going to start off with the bucket, as it were, that's the eighth one that doesn't apply to all clients. So where we have debtor information, what we can display is we can display the largest debtor percentage. Now this score can be out of a maximum of 20 points, and the way that it works is the higher the debtor concentration, the higher the score, because the higher the perceived risk would be for the client. Now this works on a sliding scale. So for example, any clients that have over 90% concentration will be given a score of the maximum of 20. Next down would be 7 to 80 at 15 points, so on and so forth. So it is exponentially bigger towards the top because the risk is deemed to be higher. Moving on to the next one, we have the sales movement score. Now this similarly has a maximum score of 20. And the way this works is it compares sales in the last 30 days versus sales in the last 90 days, and then it puts that into a percentage. The way this works, it's given a point for every 5% over the 90-day average. So that is to say, the higher the movement, the higher the score. And you'll notice if you were to look at this particular client that's highlighted, Heritage Crystal Clean, you'll see this client has a score of 51% increase with a score of 10. However, if we look below at Gilbert & Co, this has a negative movement of about the same, 52%, and you'll see that it actually has a score of 0. Now the reason for this is that we only give high scores to high movements, positive movements, sorry. The reason being that positive movement in sales can usually cause things such as fresh air or over trading, whereas a reduction in sales can of course be negative, perhaps if business has dried up. That tends to mean that the funds in use will come down with it. Therefore for the financier, the perceived risk is actually not as bad as when the sales movement has increased rapidly. Moving on to the next one, the cash movement score. This particular bucket has a maximum score of 10. The way it works is actually very much the opposite of the sales movement. So whereas, as you can see with Heritage Crystal Clean, this one has a positive cash movement of 42, it's been given 0 points. It's a good thing. If we look above and below at Austin and Gilbert, you'll see they've had negative cash movement scores, and they've been given some points. Now, the reason for this, of course, is less cash coming in is definitely a higher risk. It could mean things such as disputes or indeed direct banking. So therefore, something to look out for when you're looking into the score.
Thanks, Richard. Next across, we have the target DSO versus the DSO. So the risk factor DSO calculation works on a count-back method. So it will calculate how many days prior to today the cumulative net sales need to go back to equal the gross ledger balance. So in the example here, we've got 88 days from today for the notified sales less dilution to equal the ledger balance. And we have a target of 51. So we're comparing the actual DSO against the target. And you will score 1 point for every day the DSO is in excess of 90% of the target, and we'll show a little worked example of that later. And this element of the risk score will score a maximum of 20 points. Now, setting the target DSO is a really important aspect of the system, and again we'll cover that a little bit later, but it will default to 60. So if we just move to the cash turn measure as well, you'll see that this is also a measure which is comparing against the target DSO. So the risk score uses the 30-day cash turn measure, and the cash turn is the number of days it will take to collect the gross ledger balance based on the cash that's been received over the last 30 days. So in the example here, it will take us 66 days to collect the ledger, again based on the target of 51. And as with the DSO, you will score 1 point for every day the cash turn is in excess of 90%, up to a maximum of 20 points. And we do recommend focusing on the cash turn because it will highlight any changes, any reduction in the cash much more quickly than the DSO. If we just move to the next measure, the commitment recovery, or the funds in use recovery as it may be called in your system. And this measure looks at the percentage of borrowings that have been repaid by cash over the last 30 days. And it compares the cash received over the last 30 days to your borrowings and expresses those as a percentage. So we have 58%, so that's on the low side, and that's why that measure is at caution. So with this measure, the higher the percentage, the better. And you will score 1 point for every 5% you're under 100%. So to bring this example to life, if you have 100 minus 58 is 42. 42 divided by 5 is 8.4. So we round that to 8 to give it the 8 points. And again, that will score a maximum of 20 points.
Brilliant. And we'll now move on to the cash desperation percentage. So this measure looks at the frequency which customers take payments from the lender. It provides an indication of the apparent need the client has for cash and possibly the cash flow demands of the business. A typical business with cash flow within reasonable control will have a cash desperation of less than 25% and a score of 5 or less. If a client consistently has a cash desperation greater than 75%, then this may be an indication that the business is under cash flow pressure. The lower the percentage, the better with cash desperation. And the maximum score here is 20, and this scores 1 point for every 5%. The next one along is our net dilution percentage. So the net dilution is calculated over the last 30 days, expressing the percentage of sales that the dilution represents. This has a maximum score of 10 points, and it scores 1 point for every percentage point. So if we just have a look here at Gilbert & Co, for example, we've got a dilution there of 31%, but the score is 10. Whereas if we go to the top to Orstown, we can see that it matches, so 0, 0, and the one underneath Heritage is 4 and 4. So that one Gilbert and Co there is just capping out at the 10, which is the maximum that you can get for this particular measure. And then we've got our risk score and risk score normalised. So risk score is purely counting the points from across those 7 or 8 measures, and the risk score normalised is what Andrea talked about earlier on, where this is where we take all of these scores depending on whether we have that top debtor information and then give you a score out of 100, which allows you to compare clients against each other. And it is this risk score normalised that we really should be using, and we'll talk about a little bit more about that in some of the questions we received as well.
Thanks, Dan. So hopefully that gives a good explanation as to how the risk score is broken down and where the different scores come from. So we're just going to move into some questions now. So as we said at the beginning, we asked people to send in questions ahead of the session. So thank you very much for everybody that took the time to do that. We did receive a large number of questions. Obviously, we're not going to be able to cover them all on the session here today, but what we will do is if we don't cover your question, is we will come back to you via email and answer that. So we have 3 questions that we're going to run through today. So as we have here on the screen, one of the most popular questions that we received was, what measure has the ability to affect the risk score the most? And if we just move to the next slide, please, Richard, the short answer in that is the target DSO. So as we said previously, we're just going to cover off how important the target DSO and how this actually works from a scoring perspective. So in our example here, you can see we have a target DSO of 36. And as we said, you score 1 point for every day you're over 90% of the target. So 90% is 32.4 and the actual is 40. So if you do the 40 minus the 32.4 gives you the 7.6. We round that up and that's how you can see that we're scoring 8 points here for this particular measure. What Richard's going to do now is just to cover what happens if you set the target DSO wrong. So maybe it's set too high or maybe it's set too low.
Perfect. So yeah, first of all, we're going to start with the example of the DSO being set too high. Now we're going to use the client from before, Gilbert & Co. Now this client is a recruitment consultant and their terms of trade are, as could be expected, a relatively low 30 days from the date of invoice. Now, the first thing you'll spot on the screen towards the top at the right is on the target DSO column, you'll see that this particular client's been given a score of 60. Now, 60 is the default term that is given when a client joins Riskfactor, so that's one to look out for. Now, the issue here is that with trading terms of 30 and a target DSO of 60, naturally that's way too high. And we can see the proof in the pudding. If we look at the DSO column on May 2021 all the way up to February 22, we can see that it's only in December that January, that the risk score is picked up as being as caution. The reason for this, Given that the target DSO in the system is 60, Riskfactor thinks everything is okay and therefore is not flagging it. So it really just does show the importance of why it should be set correctly. If we look towards the bottom screen, you'll see that on the grid that we saw in the demo, if you were to look at the score itself, you'll see that the actual DSO is hardly having any points again until January 2022. So for example, if we looked at May 21, where there's 41 points, you'll see that actually there's nothing to do with the risk score there at all, when in reality there should be, and therefore the score should be a lot higher. We therefore think for this particular client, a more appropriate target would be 40 days, maybe a little bit less even. But what it would mean is that it would flag a lot sooner, and indeed during the whole period that's on the screen in front of you. And if we can move on to the next slide, we'll now look at the opposite side. So what happens if that target DSO is set too low? Now this client, PowerShare Global, they're a precision engineer, and as you might expect, they tend to have longer terms of trade. In this case, we're going to go for 60 days from end of month invoice. Now you'll see that the target DSO has been set at 51, which is already low, even if it was 60 days from day of invoice. So therefore, as you can see, there's quite a colourful screen at the top where the DSO has been flagging during the whole period. Now, if we were to look at the screen below, you will see that the DSO score and the cash turn score are again maxed out for most of the time. And if we look in particular at December 2019, there's a risk score of 71, but a total of 40 points. So over half have been given to a DSO score and cash turn score, and in our opinion, erroneously given. We would say that a target DSO should actually be around 75 days in this case, where if you actually look at the real debt score, it's only just slightly under at 74. So the reason why this is important, well, if you have clients that should be appearing when they aren't and vice versa, this means that your monthly risk meetings, if you're using Riskfactor to help you with them, you're going to get the wrong clients in, and therefore you're going to miss key risks and indeed waste time on clients that shouldn't be in there, all because the target DSO has not been set correctly. If we could just move on to the next slide, just to reiterate the importance of it there. What we've done is just as a recap, we've given the maximum scores available for each bucket. And alongside that, we've actually highlighted and bolded the ones where the target DSO is affecting it. So you can see out of a possible up to 140, 40 points are actually being changed or influenced by that target DSO. Therefore, up to a third of the risk score could potentially be wrong if the target DSO is wrong. And then moving on to the next slide, just some hints and tips of how best to use it. So as we mentioned just earlier, so the default when a client appears on Riskfactor is a score of 60. We therefore recommend that the moment you see a new client on, so the day after they join, make sure that that target DSO and Riskfactor is set correctly. That just therefore means that you've got right from the get-go, you've got that correct, and therefore you're going to get a more appropriate risk score. On the same theme, make sure 3 to 4 months later you actually review that DSO. We all know that some clients can join and essentially have a different target DSO to what's been given to them. So make sure that that's reviewed. I'd also recommend that you make sure that target DSO is in line with other clients in the industry. Chances are you will have similar clients. Just make sure, use Riskfactor to compare the two different clients or multiple ones, just to make sure that's all looking good. If you are going to change that target DSO, because of course there will be genuine valid reasons why that needs to be changed, we'd recommend perhaps using one of our Riskfactor templates to help you to do so. What this does is it enables you to add comments, as you can see at the bottom right, just to give rationale for any changes that are proposed, and you can even use the comments for approval, just to make sure you do have that full audit trail. Annual reviews is another opportunity where you should be looking at your target DSOs. And of course, I'm sure you do that anyway as part of your reviews, but also Riskfactor on an annual basis at least. Make sure that is definitely set correct and is still relevant to how the client is performing. If indeed you notice any large changes within Riskfactor, for example, something like 10 days in a short period of time, make sure just to check that, we'd recommend that you make sure just to check that the payment terms that you're seeing in Riskfactor are matching those that are on the invoices that you're being sent. And perhaps even perform telephone debt verification exercises just to make sure that everything is okay there. And finally, just to encompass everything we've mentioned there before, the importance of the target DSO in Riskfactor, we'd also recommend that make sure that not everyone can change it, because one little change can make such a big difference. Therefore, we'd recommend that only certain users within your business have the authority to be able to change that within Riskfactor.
Thanks, Richard. And if we just move to the next slide. So as you can see, the next question is, do you think it's sufficient to monitor the risk in the portfolio solely using the risk score? And whilst the overall risk score is important and will indicate the potential risk of a client, we don't recommend solely using this measure in isolation. In fact, we've seen a number of fraud cases where, in fact, the overall risk score has been still relatively quite low and certainly hasn't always been at caution. And just going back to what Richard was just covering, quite often this is because the target DSO has been set incorrectly. What we would recommend is it's important to understand what's driving the changes in the risk score. So don't wait for it to move to caution or to alert. Understand what's causing those changes. And we recommend a good way of doing this is to use focus lists. So for example, if you have a focus list which tells you of sales movement greater than 30%, or where you have dilution of greater than 10%. And what we would also recommend is that client managers have personal portfolios which mirror the focus list criteria. So it's easy to see at a glance which of your clients are falling into those categories. Similarly, using reporting as well is also a good way of picking up potential clients that are perhaps overpaid. So whilst the risk score is important, it is more important to understand what is influencing the changes in that. So hopefully by doing that, you will be able to pick up the changes and address them and react to them more quickly and potentially avoid any issues before just waiting for the risk score to increase.
Brilliant, thanks, Andrea. And on to the third question, which was around which risk score measure should we be using and why. So we have touched on this on a number of times as we've gone through the grids there. So we do have two risk score measures within Riskfactor. So risk score and risk score normalised. So as I mentioned earlier, the risk score is purely counting up the number of points scored across each of the measures. So whether that's the 7 or 8. And then the risk score normalised, this is where we're normalising the score so that where there are customers that don't share their debtor data, you're able to compare the two facilities like for like. So we're pulling all of those scores together and giving you a score out of 100. The risk score normalised is the key measure and the one that you should be using and reviewing. As you can see on the grid here, Orstown Financial, you can see that if we're using risk score, that's at caution. But after normalising, this is actually only at 28 and in black and is nice and steady. It can make a real difference to the clients that you're picking up in risk reviews, PRMs, and the like if you're using the risk score versus the normalised. And it's a measure that's really important, but only really valuable if you're comparing using the correct one. As Andrea's just said, it's not just about focusing solely on this score, but it's really important that you're using the correct score to compare clients and also pick up any issues as soon as possible. And by using just the risk score measure, you do have the potential to miss some of those really vital movements. So just to recap some of the parts that we've gone over. So remember to use the risk score analysis grid to understand the key components. Always use the normalised risk score when comparing clients. The different measures are weighted differently, so either 10 or 20 points. And the target DSO counts for up to a third. Obviously, we've spoken a lot about the target DSO, but it really is an important measure. The target DSO defaults to 60 when a client first appears in Riskfactor. And make sure to regularly review the target DSO as an absolute minimum annually, but best practice would be certainly to review this more regularly. And Andrea, I'll hand over to you just to finish up.
Thank you, Dan, and thank you to Dan as well, because I don't know if you've probably noticed he's got a very sore throat, so he's struggled through doing that. So thank you, Dan, and thank you to everybody for joining today's session. As we said at the beginning, the idea of these is to be short and focused and to focus on particular topics. Hopefully you found this useful, either as a refresher or if you're relatively new to Riskfactor, that you've picked up something new. We'll be sending out a short survey after the session today, because the idea is that we're going to repeat these sessions frequently, and we'd really love to get your feedback on what we've covered today and also what you'd like to cover in future sessions. As we said as well, we will respond to you with regards to the questions that have been asked. Not all of them were in relation to the risk factor topic of the score today, but we will come back to all of the individual questions, and we will share the slides after the session as well. So again, thank you everybody for joining. We hope you found it useful. Thank you.